Africa.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Good afternoon and a very warm welcome to the afternoon beat with myself, Syed Jadwit. We're coming to you live out of our studios in Johannesburg, broadcasting on various platforms: Facebook, Twitter, well, now X, YouTube, as well as on air. You can also catch us this afternoon. We are actually coming to you with quite an interesting conversation this afternoon, or at least a topic that I thought would be quite interesting, especially 2025 with all that's happening around us in the world on the global stage. G20, the summit set to take place in South Africa later this year in November. And to make sense of all of this, I'm joined now by Professor Daniel Bradlow, who is South African Research Chairs Initiative. He's a professor of international development law and African economic relations. Professor, thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us. Welcome to Salam Media.
Thank you. Thanks for inviting me, and good afternoon to you and the listeners.
So, quite a great deal of coverage has taken place regarding the G20 Group of 20. It's South Africa's time under the spotlight, notwithstanding all that is happening on the global stage. But I think to begin with, if you could just start by giving us a quick overview of what the G20 is and how it actually works. You know, who's involved, how do they make decisions, what sort of decisions do they make, and why does that matter?
So maybe it's useful to begin with a bit of history to put it in context. So the G20 began in the 1990s as a group of ministers of finance from what were considered 20 of the leading economies around the world to deal with partly with the Asian financial crisis at that time and what was going on in the world. It was a recognition that the G7 was no longer really capable of managing the global economy in the same way that they had before, and that other countries had to play a more important role. When the global financial crisis came in 2008, the G20 was sort of upgraded to a meeting of heads of states and heads of government. And the 20 countries, it's a bit of a misnomer because there are 19 countries, and then the European Union, and then since the last couple of years, the African Union has joined. So it's bigger than it seems. And every year they also invite a group of what are called guests. So a group of countries that the country that chairs the G20 that year feels should be invited to participate as well. And then they joined also by a group of international organizations. So the World Bank, the IMF, the UN Development Program, the UN itself, so a range of other institutions. So it's a much bigger meeting than it might seem. South Africa was historically the only African country in the grouping until the African Union joined. And so now Africa is represented more broadly than just South Africa. And the goal of the group is really to deal with the major problems in the world, to try and promote international cooperation amongst countries, to try and come up with ways that they can solve those problems. The challenge is it has no authority to make any binding decisions. So the countries can agree to things and then go home and do whatever they want, including, in the best case, do what they said they would do, and in the worst case, do something different from that.
Now, when we're speaking about the G20, I think if you could just, for those who are unfamiliar, maybe just a rundown of some of the countries that are a part of this grouping, but also we do know that it represents around 85% of the global economy. So the question then also is, how does this concentration of economic power influence the group's ability to address global challenges?
So if maybe understanding who's in the group gives you a sense of what they're capable of. So it's to start, not in no particular order, it's the G7 countries. So that's the US, Canada, the UK, France, Germany, Italy, and Japan. And then added to that are countries like China, India, Turkey, Mexico, Argentina, Indonesia, South Africa, Australia. So what were considered to be the 20 biggest economies in the world, but it's not really. For example, South Africa would not be there if this was truly the 20 biggest economies in the world. Um, but we're viewed as the biggest economy in Africa at the time, and as an important player on the global stage, and that was why it was felt South Africa should be there. Um, and as you say, because the countries represent 85% of the global economy, but also majority of the world's population, because you've got the biggest countries, India, China, Indonesia, the US are members. Russia is a member as well. Um, it's felt that it is somewhat representative of the world, even though it's only 20 of the 193 countries in the world that are members, but that because of that, if they decide to do something, that's sufficient sort of binding power to force to make that a workable arrangement for the whole world. And then it's hoped that the international organizations can help persuade other countries to go along with it as well.
Mm. Obviously, this isn't a formal organization. It's not the UN. Why does that informal structure actually matter, and does it make it more or less effective?
So it does both, I suppose, because the thing with the UN is it's 193 or thereabouts countries. To get 193 countries to agree on anything is extremely difficult. To have a real discussion on a particular issue is very difficult in that setting. And so to really have a forum where you can have countries come together and actually agree on something and have a proper discussion and work out how to deal with a problem, you need a smaller grouping. And so in that sense, the G20 is about a reasonable size to do that. The problem is no one selected this group. They selected themselves as the 20 countries in the group. And so that um, there's a representation issue is why these countries, and how do you make sure that the voice of other countries that might not agree with the way things are being discussed can also get a hearing in this.
Hmm. I mean, when we think of organizations such as the G20, the United Nations, I think a lot of the criticism that comes from the general public is that these organizations are mere talk shops. People don't actually, or the perception is that people don't actually feel the impact of these bodies and organizations. Can you perhaps think of any example when the G20 actually set to address something and actually did something about it?
So I would say that the most successful the G20 was during the financial crisis in 2008, where countries came together and they agreed on how they would work together to stimulate the global economy. And their actions managed to avoid the worst possible outcome. So they managed to avoid a Great Depression. They managed to pump more money into the global economy so it could avoid a recession and begin growing again. And countries agreed on that, and they also agreed on new regulations for the banking sector to try and avoid getting into a problem again. And so that was a moment where they really did show coordinated action and success. Um, Another action time when they tried to do this but didn't really succeed was during the COVID crisis, um, where they were trying to work out what should be the global strategy. How serious is this pandemic? But they didn't really succeed very well. And as we know, when the vaccine was created, there was a lot of hoarding of vaccines around the world in rich countries, so that vaccines didn't get to everybody in a fair and equitable manner. And that if the G20 were working as effectively as it should have been, there would have been a more fair distribution of vaccines around the world and of face masks and other private protective gear that could have been used to limit the suffering that might follow from that. So it's a difficult. It has at the margins had, and in crisis it has a big impact. It can have a big impact, but as you can see, it depends on the nature of the crisis, and it depends on how well the countries are getting on with each other as well.
Hmm. I mean, if we look at this situation on the global stage, it's quite an uncertain time we're living in. There's a lot
Yeah.
happening. There's, many countries involved, lots of interest involved. It's just a whole lot going on at the same time. And this is the year 2025 when South Africa is the president of the G20. We know that later on in the year, in around November, is when that G20 Leaders Summit is going to be taking place. How do you see this, South Africa's presidency actually reflecting in the work of the G20 this year, and the South African approach to all of this?
So, you're chair for a year, and a year is a relatively short time. And there are many issues which are sort of carried over from one year to the next in the G20. And so South Africa takes over in our case, we took it over from Brazil, which was the chair last year. And so there's some sort of unfinished business from that has to be dealt with this year. And then South Africa has the opportunity as the chair to add some new issues to that. And South Africa has said that some of the issues they would like to see raised are issues of particular importance to Africa. So the sovereign debt issue, loss and damage in climate, critical minerals, dealing with disasters, food security could be an issue. It's unlikely that all of those issues can be dealt with this year, but if South Africa can get them on the agenda, get the G20 thinking about them and talking about possible solutions to these issues, there's a possibility that over the next few years, action can happen. And in that regard, it's important to keep in mind the way the G20 works is South Africa is the chair, but it works in what's called the Troika. And the Troika consists of the past president, the current president, and the future president of the G20. So that means this year the Troika is Brazil, which was the chair last year, South Africa as the chair this year, and then the United States, which will be the chair next year. And so that South Africa, because it'll be in the Troika next year as the past chair, also has some potential to influence the agenda next year as well.
Professor Bradlow, I think that sets the stage for our discussion. I think it gives us quite a detailed overview of what the G20 is and what it's meant to do. But let's take a quick break, and I think when we come back from that ad break, we'll unpack what's really at stake here. And I think that's the crux of an article that you wrote, which I came across on the conversation. So if we can just hold on for a moment, and when we come back, we'll continue with this.
Loved, secure, and cared for. At Beit Halima Sadia Orphanage, we are not just providing a roof over their heads, we're giving orphan children a chance for a brighter future. For just 1,500 rands a month or 18,000 rands a year, you can sponsor an orphan and transform their life. Your contribution covers essentials like food, clothing, tuition, therapy, and more, ensuring they grow in a nurturing, supportive environment. Any donation is accepted as well as daily scheduled donations. EFT directly into our account. Beit Halima Sadia Orphanage, First National Bank, account number 6313-1080-078, branch code 250737, section 18A registered. Take this step today. Contact Sister Nazarene at 083-653-5669 or email info@bhscycc.co.za.
Shimmer, sparkle, captivate. Nothing less than a masterpiece. Droplets of gold inspires precious design. Platinum bursts with intricate freshness, and every pure diamond becomes more than just a girl's best friend. Voda Gold Gem Jewelers, where timeless dreams become a reality. Come to us. We tailor-make designer gold, platinum, and diamond jewelry. Trade in or remodel your old gold. Clad yourself with classy name-branded watches. We offer insurance valuation and freezer card calculation. Visit us at 534 Ridge Road, Overport, or call 031-208-9142. Voda Gold Gem Jewelers, manufacturers of fine gold and diamond jewelry.
Our brothers and sisters in Palestine are enduring unimaginable hardships. Ashraful aid teams are on the ground, delivering crucial aid to those in need. But we can't do it alone. Palestine is suffering and they need your help. Your support can make a world of difference. Visit www.ashrafulaid.org today and donate to bring hope, relief, and healing to those who are in need.
Penny Appeal's Education First campaign helps children to get access to quality education.
I'm 14 years old. When I grow up, I'd like to be a scientist.
We believe every child belongs at school,
And we want education, a better education.
learning and dreaming their way to a better future. With your help, we can provide classrooms, desks, stationery packs, and school shoes. Help make these dreams a reality. Visit www.pennyappeal.org.za or call 031 1100 573. Penny Appeal. Small change, big difference.
You know, it's a wonder how kids get anything done these days. With all the distractions, when do they even get time to study? As a mother, all I can really do is make sure they have all they need to perform at their best. That's why I choose to include Sunfoil, triple refined pure sunflower oil with every meal I make. Naturally cholesterol-free and approved by the Heart and Stroke Foundation as part of a balanced eating plan. So whether I'm cooking, frying, or baking, I know every dish will be a wholesome one. Sunfoil, now we're cooking.
When the perfect blend of stylish decor, exquisite halal cuisine, and warm hospitality come together, it could only mean Albeit Lodge, your true home away from home. Albeit is the ideal heaven for families, business people, and tourists with its 4-star family rooms and other luxurious facilities. Conveniently situated close to Port Elizabeth Airport, the beach, and other amenities, your stay will be truly unforgettable, as you'll be taking home lasting memories of the warm hospitality, the serenity and tranquility that Albeit has to offer. For reservations, call 041 583 6415 or visit www.albeitlodge.co.za.
You are listening to Salam Media live from our headquarters in South Africa. This is Salam Media, keeping you company this Ramadan.
The time has just gone 34 minutes past 4 p.m. Central African time. Welcome back. You are tuned into Salam Media. My name is Zaid Jadwat, and we are in conversation with Professor Daniel Bradlow. He is, of course, Professor of International Development Law and African Economic Relations. What are we talking about? Well, the G20, something you most likely have heard about, especially considering that South Africa is chairing this group of 20 very powerful countries in 2025. Just before the ad break, Professor, we were speaking about what the G20 is, perhaps also why it matters. But I think also more recently, one of the concerns about the G20 has been the risk of it possibly losing legitimacy. Do you see any signs that it's struggling, and perhaps what it would take to restore trust in it?
There's definitely signs that it's taking a lot of strain. I mean, part of that, which was South Africa didn't know when it sort of knew that its turn would be coming up, is that President Trump would become the president in the US, and that US ministers would not necessarily come to the meetings, as they didn't come to the first round of meetings in February, in the ministers of foreign affairs in Joburg in February, and then the ministers of finance in Cape Town a week later. So that's one unknown at this point, really. The other thing is that the conflict in Ukraine has been an ongoing source of challenge for the G20, because you have Russia, you have the European countries, you have the US there, and it's made reaching agreement on many issues very difficult, because that issue seems to poison the atmosphere and make it hard to reach agreement. On the other hand, there's in a sense an opportunity in this, because if it's understood that it's impossible to make agreement by consensus, then maybe it becomes possible for subgroups of willing countries to act together. And if you keep in mind that the way the G20 works is they're the ministerial meetings, and then the end of the process, as you mentioned at the beginning, is the summit that'll be in Johannesburg in November, where the heads of government and state come. But underneath that, you have lots of working groups of civil servants, technical level people who meeting to discuss issues, try resolve the disagreements between them, understand each other's positions better. And that process has been going on continually, no matter what the problems in the G20 is. And that has meant that on some issues, more technical sorts of issues, there is scope for agreement. And also because different groups of officials meet all the time, they get to know each other, and it makes some form of collaboration more easy than it would have been without the G20. So in that sense, it's all a positive. On the other hand, there is a serious issue. As I said, you've got 20 countries out of the 193 countries participating, and many countries say, well, why should we you 20 countries be the ones that decide these issues? These are the issues that are more appropriately discussed in the UN or in other forums where all the countries participate. So the legitimacy issue is becoming more of an important issue as the tensions in the world and the uncertainty goes up.
I mean, I'm looking in front of me here is an article that you've pinned. It's called G20, How It Works, Why It Matters, and What Would Be Lost If It Failed. And I think the first part of that we've covered, we've touched on that in so far in our conversation. But moving over to the potential for this actually not working out and for things to really go wrong here. What's a worst case scenario that you envision if it can't adapt or it collapses entirely as a result of these, the strains that it's coming under?
So, I mean, the worst case, as you say, would be if this year, when we get to the summit, a whole group of the 20 countries say we're not coming or we're not sending our head of state. So we could expect that President Putin of Russia will not come because of his problems with the International Criminal Court. It's possible that other heads of state would say they're not coming for various reasons. And if that happened, that would be a problem. If the process falls apart, it's a problem in the sense that the world, that's a signal to the world that reaching agreement on important issues such as the climate issue, migration issues, debt issues, food security, all the issues that are really important for the lives of people are not being dealt with at an international level in any way. It's true that if the G20 falls apart, there are other ways it could happen in the UN or in other forums. But the problem is if the 20 biggest economies in the world, or at least most of the big economies, can't agree when they meet on their own, what are the chances that when they go to the UN, they're going to agree there? And if they don't agree, even if they get outvoted, a General Assembly resolution that the major countries in the world don't agree with is unlikely to really have a very big impact. So the end of the G20 would be a serious moment for the world. It would force the world to think, how do we come up with a different method that allows some sort of effective decision-making for the governance of the international system?
I mean, that leads me to the next question, which is, when we're talking about things like climate change or pandemics, these are sort of things that require leadership. And especially in a globalized world as the one we live in today, this obviously calls for a certain degree of cooperation. But if something like the G20 can't actually function, one wonders then where does this leadership come from? What happens in the vacuum?
That's the big worry, because you're right. You can't deal with these issues without leadership, and it's hard to see where the leadership is coming from now. It's more likely to see how the leaders are going to be in conflict and unable to deal with these issues. But the opportunity is for countries then to say, well, if we can't all agree, let at least those that are willing to reach agreement on these issues, let us at least get together and agree amongst ourselves and try convince most of the world to go along with what we say. And on an issue like climate, for example, I think the vast majority of countries in the world and the vast majority of people in the world acknowledge that there is a climate crisis and that we do need to deal with that. If a minority of people and countries don't accept that, then maybe we just have to work out a way to work around them and to say the rest of us are going to work together to solve this problem. It won't be as the optimal solution because we don't have everyone involved, but we have as many countries and as many different actors as possible involved in that, and that at least can try resolve the crisis to some extent. And over time, hopefully that convinces everybody to join us. Likewise, with the pandemic, we can hope that there can be some movement on that, because so many people actually do if there is a pandemic, understand the need for cooperation and everybody to work together. It's in a sense for South Africa this year, because it's such a difficult year for the world, it's going to require us to be very skilled diplomats in managing the process and in working out where there's an issue where there's enough agreement that we can form a tactical alliance with countries and say, look, we all agree this issue must be dealt with. And the debt issue is another example of that. And even though there's much that we don't agree on, at least let us come to some sort of a solution on this one issue that we all agree needs to be dealt with.
What are some of the steps that South Africa, being the chair of the G20 this year, and perhaps some of the other stakeholders as well, can actually take to ensure that the G20 remains relevant? Perhaps also, what's that one issue that you're looking forward to them addressing in the year ahead?
So look, diplomacy is all about talking and trying to convince people and other countries to cooperate together. If the talking fails, then there's only force left of various sorts, not necessarily violent force, but bullying of some sort that will have to be dealt with. So South Africa has to use its persuasive skills and its skills of trying to move countries towards an agreement on certain issues. To me, the issues where there's easier agreement, things like climate, there's still a lot of disagreement, even though we all agree that there is a problem that has to be dealt with. But the issue where there are agreements is around some of the finance issues, that countries that are experiencing terrible droughts or terrible floods or hurricanes or things like that, which are devastating them, need some support in order to recover from that. The fact that there are countries, many countries in Africa, but not only in Africa, who's spending more of their government resources servicing their debts than on health or education, is just not a sustainable or acceptable solution. And it's in everybody's interest to deal with that. From a European perspective, if that crisis isn't dealt with, the chances that more people are going to migrate to Europe goes up. And for Europe, that becomes a security issue as well. So it's in their interests, purely for their own personal, selfish interests, in a sense, to help deal with those problems. And I think we have to say that South Africa has to try convince countries that these are the sorts of issues where everybody agrees, despite all the other issues that we don't agree on.
Prof, I think we're only really touching the surface of this conversation, but unfortunately we have run out of time, and I would really love to continue this conversation, but this is where we have to leave it this afternoon. Thank you so much for your time.
Thanks for inviting me. Bye-bye.
That was Professor Daniel Bradlow, a professor of international development law and African economic relations at the University of Pretoria, speaking to us about the G20. You may have heard about it, and if you haven't already, chances are you're definitely going to hear about it in the year ahead, especially since South Africa is chairing this group of 20 nations, some of them quite powerful on the global stage. And in a time of great uncertainty and confusion. I don't know if that's one way to put it. But yeah, definitely something that requires a lot more time to unpack and really do justice to that conversation. But hopefully, in the weeks and months ahead, we can really come back to this conversation, revisit it, and ultimately gain a better understanding of the G20 and how all of these things actually work in the world. The time now is exactly 14 minutes to 5 p.m. Let's take a break.